Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, rather. I hope everything is nice and there at the conference virtually. Thank you very much for having me today. I want to talk to you today a little bit about things that you must have heard either indirectly and surely in the presentation we just heard about evidence-based policing, the promise that it might hold for policing in Chile and elsewhere, and some of the realities around this and the complexities of trying to implement this approach in policing. So I'm going to talk about what evidence-based policing is about. I'm going to break it down to something that is more tangible, something that we can possibly then translate into actions in the near future. And then I'm going to give a couple of examples where evidence-based policing and this collaboration between research and academics or research agencies might help policing, legitimacy of policing, and the efficiency and effectiveness of this institution. So what is evidence-based policing, and what does it entail? It essentially means using research and the scientific approach to policing. There are a lot of decision-making processes in law enforcement, and some of them are very intuitive, so a decision that an officer must make at the heat of the moment. And there are also strategic decisions, by which I mean that somebody has to think about all the implications of a decision. And when you're trying to shift this big boat that's called the police, left or right, depending on the decision that's being made, then there are a lot of reasons why it can go wrong, and there are a lot of reasons why it can mushroom. Evidence-based policing calls to use data, using research and using the best available research that we have to make that decision. Sometimes the decision can be as simple as looking at the police records and understanding that there's a hotspot or there's an issue that we have to deal with, and that's fine. The point of evidence-based policing is not to replace decision-making in policing. It's to add on another layer, another facet, another instrument within this process, within this element of making a decision that could potentially help. So by this, we can, for example, understand what works and what doesn't work. We can look at the research evidence to say, this approach has been tried before in other places, and the evidence doesn't support this approach, or it does support this approach, and we should keep on doing what we're doing right now. And it also means to create new research and to create new evidence, because it's an ongoing process. It's not just about conducting one study and then disappearing in thin air. It really is about a continuous relationship between external researchers and the police departments to know what is the best evidence for a particular strategy or a particular tactic that we're keen to understand if it's helping or not. There are loads of examples in policing of tactics that don't work. For example, the random patrol in the city is not an effective way of deterring crime, and there's research that suggests that that's the case, that if your officers are patrolling in a random sort of way, the effectiveness of this patrol is questionable, whereas opposed to that, using hotspots policing is more efficient because you're targeting the right things. So when I say targeting, when I think about what is it that works and what doesn't work and how we can produce new research evidence, there are different approaches to understanding this problem. One of them is what's called the triple T. And I personally think that the triple T approach to understanding what evidence-based policing is about and how we can translate this into action is a really useful paradigm. Evidence-based policing, when you think about this as the triple T approach, asks for three elements, which are intertwined, they're connected. One is to target the right things. In other words, looking for the actions that will produce the biggest benefit that you can. And it's not that easy because there are different kinds of outcomes and outputs you can analyze and different kinds of strategies to get to what is best when you're trying to target a problem. But that is one element of the story, and I'm going to give you some examples in just a few seconds. Then the other element of this triple T approach is testing. It's the idea of using the scientific method to measure and to analyze and to test what works, to what extent does it work, if it's efficient compared to what, if it's effective, how much does it cost us? So the testing element is exactly where the scientists can help measure something that works and to what extent. And then the final bit, which I will probably concentrate on the most because it's one of the most important things or issues that we have in law enforcement all over the world, is tracking whether the strategies that we come up with are being implemented. That's a major problem. So, for example, I know that hotspots policing is something that the police in Chile are doing, and they're doing rather well in terms of analyzing and detecting where crime concentrates, and that's really impressive. But the problem is not about the analytical bit. The problem is not about the research behind that. The problem is whether the officers are actually doing it. And we are seeing research evidence from around the world that shows that officers are not implementing strategies and tactics the way that we want them to, because they're human beings, because it's not easy, because it's not always something that officers would like to do. They might want to do something else based on their professional expertise. But if you have a strategy that you want to implement, you got to make sure they do it. And we see the same problem in medicine, in engineering, and so on. So I'm going to try to focus on this element in just a few seconds. So if I can, I will try to start by talking about the targeting approach or the issues that we have. And I'm going to focus on something that the police in Chile are well aware of and try to see whether we can help out to embellish it to create an even more effective tactic. And that's the issue of concentration of crime in place. For some time now, we know that just about half of all the reported crime concentrates in less than 5% of places. And these are the famous hotspots. So we know that if we take all the reported crime in the city and we try to map it on the map, then we will find that just about half of the calls for service concentrate in less than 5% of places. And the way you define the place can vary. It can be a street segment, it could be a polygon, it could be a specific address. But the point remains that we do have a heavy concentration of crime in specific areas. And that's really useful to know because that means you can target these places. Instead of roaming around the city to try to understand where crime might take place and try to prevent it in the first place, then knowing that most of the crime comes from a very small number of places is actually quite beneficial. And we have research evidence from all over the world. So you have some numbers around here from a recent study by Professor David Weisberg, who is one of the world famous criminologists who studies this concentration phenomenon to the point that he calls it a law of concentration because it repeats itself all the time. And based on this approach, the police in Chile have come up with a system, a really good system, in which we can target these specific places to try and to prevent crime from happening in the first place, or try to catch offenders that are likely to be in these particular places. So the operationalization, the making it real, so to speak, we can see in live action in different places on the internet. And here you can see a hotspots map that's been used in Chile to identify unique areas that are called the hotspots. And by targeting these specific areas, crime is more likely to be reduced by way of efficiency and by way of cost effectiveness. But of course, like everything in science and everything in policing as well, we can get better. There are ways to improve the existing system in different ways. And I just want to give one example where, based on a scientific approach, we can try to use hotspots policing in even more efficient way. And the findings you will hear now haven't been published yet, but we're working on the publication. And I hope you find it interesting. we've looked at these hotspots and we said, okay, what is in a hotspot? Well, in a hotspot, we have different buildings and we have different houses and different stores and different nighttime economy clubs and nightclubs and pubs and so on, and where children, young people hang out and so on. So within that hotspot, when you take a more granular analysis of the place, you suddenly realize that almost half of the outdoor crime actually comes from one, possibly two addresses within the hotspot. So there's a concentration of concentrations within the hotspot itself. And that could be really useful because if you tell an officer, could you please go and patrol a hotspot? The first question they would ask, what am I looking for? What is the problem that I'm trying to solve? How can I localize my professional knowledge of deterrence and catching bad guys to that particular area? And if you can pinpoint the problem to a specific place, then problem solving can be a lot more efficient because then you can concentrate on a specific address rather than the entire area. And that's useful for police as well as for evidence-based policing from a scientific/academic perspective. So that's one example, if I may, of how we can increase the accuracy and increase the precision of policing by looking more granularly at the hotspots, which are, by the way, is a consistent finding. You can see over the years that again and again, the top address in this specific area in Birmingham, within the hotspot in Birmingham, produces most of the crime. But again, that's just one facet. That's just one area that might be helpful. You can also think about maybe reevaluating the way that you count and look at crime. And that's a relatively new line of research that we have in criminology, that instead of counting crimes within a hotspot, or more broadly, to focus on how many crimes the police have encountered in a specific city or a specific time of the year, we call for a more, again, granular analysis by looking at the harm, the level of harm that the crime produces, rather than just the numbers themselves. And the reason is quite intuitive when you think about it. Let's say you have two hotspots. One of them has 30 crimes, but all of them are theft from person. And then you have another hotspot of crime. They only had 5 crimes in the past year, but all of them were robberies or violence or something more serious in terms of the harm that the crime causes than those theft from person. Now, I'm not belittling or thinking that theft from person is not important, but the amount of policing that we have available, the number of officers available to do the patrols is always going to be limited. We're not ever going to have full deployment of officers in every corner in the city because that's not going to be feasible ever. So instead, perhaps we can start looking into harm reduction in these hotspots and looking at the harm that's being caused by these crimes rather than simply counting them. And once you do that, you have 2 findings which are really important. And actually, Dr. Wainborn is one of the world leaders in analyzing this phenomenon. And that's looking into the harm in a way that is much more concentrated than crime volume. So he has found, him and other colleagues as well, has found that if crime counts are just about the ratio of 50% to 5%, or half the crime in 5% of places, then 80% of the harm that a city experiences concentrates in 5% of the places. So it's much more concentrated. Harm is much more concentrated when we look at it like that than if we start counting crime counts. If you look at the map, if you try to see this visually, you can see the concentrations. You can see the towers of crime harm compared to the crime counts. And you can see this research that happened in Birmingham in the UK. And you can see how much it's much more concentrated by the higher towers once you start looking into harm rather than counts. So that's a second element of targeting, which we can think about the collaboration between academics and practitioners to identify more efficient ways of conducting hotspots policing. I want to give another example. With that, I'll stop. This is one of my favorite graphs of all times because it gives you like an EKG of crime in a specific jurisdiction, but we found this all over the world. What you can see here is essentially crime, the amount of crime that a places experience over the course of the day. This, for example, is for the British Transport Police, so it's crime that is happening inside train stations. And you can see, I hope you can see that the pattern continues and repeats itself every day, that there is a bit of a peak of crime in the morning rush hour, and then it goes way up high around 4 to 7, 8 p.m. at night. And it happens every day for many, many months, everywhere that we look at it. What does this tell us? It tells us that we can use our forces more efficiently by concentrating on the right time, because there are hot hours. There are specific times of the day that crime is more likely to occur. And when this is the case, we're much more likely to prevent it, because not only that we'll be there in the right place, but we're also going to be there at the right time. So that's in terms of concentrations of crime, in terms of places, and in terms of time, and how we can make hotspots policing more efficient. So once we think about the elements that we have to target, we can move on to the next question about how do we know what works? How do we know that hotspots policing is efficient? How do we know that restorative justice might be effective in bringing back legitimacy of the police in interactions with members of the public? How do we know that restorative justice can be effective between two offenders that come together and try to solve a problem in a way that reduces the harm and restores some of the justice outside the criminal justice system, if that's an approach you want to consider? So how do we know all these things? And that's where testing comes into play. Testing essentially means using the scientific approach to analyzing the world and knowing what works and what doesn't. It's another instrument in the decision-making process where we try to understand what is it that works and what is it that doesn't. And here's probably one of the most important messages I can give from evidence-based policing. If the police, any police department, is thinking about a new strategy to deal with crime, social disorder, issues in society, and so on, the idea behind the scientific approach is to test it first on a sample, to test it first on a smaller subset of the population, and then scale it up. Because if you apply something just because you believe in it, or just because we invested in it, that's not enough to make it work. You need the numbers to show that an approach is working, that it's actually something that will provide you the benefits that you're looking for, or else there's no point of institutionalizing an approach, because then you don't know if it's worked or not. And because in law enforcement, everything is very expensive, it's best to first put some money or put some resources on a sample, on a test, on a pilot. And then based on the findings of this pilot, then potentially we'll be able to know whether we should embrace this policy, we should embrace this strategy or not. So I can give you examples from the world of internet technologies and from all these IT companies that have a product they're about to release to the public. They always test it first, because scaling it up for the website, and Amazon does it all the time, when they want to sell a new product, they test it first on a subsample of customers, and based on these results, they make the decision, we want to invest in this instrument and not invest our money in something else. I don't think law enforcement, when we're asking strategic questions, has to be different. Now, that doesn't mean that the police officer in the field is taking we're taking any of his or her discretion away. The point is really about thinking strategically. If we decide that this approach is something that we want to implement in the next few years, let's test it out first, and based on these results, we can take it forward and implement this as policy. Now, the final bit is tracking. And tracking, as I suggested earlier, is making sure that whatever strategy or tactic that we may have is something that is actually being done. And it's not that simple. Law enforcement, police officers around the world hate change. They also hate the status quo, right? But they hate change. So if you want to make sure that a new strategy is implemented, body-worn cameras, new technology, drones, hotspots policing, new ways of dealing with civil unrest, all these questions are strategic, but if the officers are not applying the treatment in a way that satisfies the dosage and making sure that they actually implement the strategy, then it doesn't matter if theoretically hotspots policing works or not. It only matters if officers are willing and able to do them. So making sure that it happens entail two elements. One is the outputs. In other words, counting whether officers are implementing the approach or not, and the outcomes, counting what happens after the officers have implemented this. So in policing, you really want to differentiate between what the police does and the outcomes of what the police does. If you make an arrest, that's not an outcome, that's an output. If crime went down following the arrest, that's an outcome. So you really have to measure both in order to see whether there is an effect or measurable effect based on the intervention. Now, in terms of knowing whether it's working or not, the UK has a really interesting approach, and that's the HMIC. It used to be called HMIC, now it's HMIC FRS, or Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services. The name's too long. But the point of this institution is really important for policing. This is like an overarching entity, an entity that is above the police, if you will. And what they do is to measure the performance of the police. They pick different questions all the time. So now, for example, they've concentrated on the response to COVID-19 in England and Wales. And they want to understand whether law enforcement and officers around the country are implementing the strategies that they have decided to implement. So there are three levels to this, and Sir Dennis O'Connor, who used to head the HMIC, is notoriously famous for being very anal and very much about measuring and making sure that it's happening. He came up with a very interesting feedback loop when implemented in policing. He said, the first thing we need to do when we want to make sure that officers are doing what they're supposed to be doing is to measure it. And for that, for example, we can use GPS tracking. If officers need to attend to hotspots for example, 15 minutes, 3 or 4 times in a day, then we need to be able to measure this, to have data so we can track the outputs, we can track whether they're doing it or not. And then based on the measurement, we have to feed back the results to the force. We have to feed it back to the officers. And based on the feedback, then we can make adjustments to the implementation of that particular idea. Now, why is that so important? Why do we really want the police to focus on these issues and have as much implementation loops and implementation strategy to make sure that officers are doing what they're being told, and to do this through a body like the HMIC? Now, I'm not saying that Chile should adopt this idea or not. It's just an example of how we can track the police in a way that might be beneficial. So the real benefit of an agency like the HMIC is not just about a political sort of oversight of the police. That's not what it's about. It's about letting the public know that this is what their tax money is doing. It's letting the police know that we are taking notice of what is it that they do to make sure that they improve themselves all the time. And the legitimacy of this entity, the legitimacy of an agency like the HMIC, is highly crucial for the entire process. If they're thought to be unbiased, if they're thought to be professional, to measure the right things, then the results can really shape the future generations of law enforcement. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because I'm running out of time. And I want to talk about the idea of the collaboration between research institutions and police agencies, that partnership, and what kind of benefit we can think about when we're trying to collaborate between the police and academics or research institutions. Now, one of the major problems that we have, and I suspect that you may have the same issue in Chile, like we have in Israel, like we have in other places around the world. The police are very protective of the data. For wider reasons, they see themselves as the guardians of the information collected by the police. And in many ways, they're right, because how can you trust an academic not to release sensitive information? How can you trust this partnership in which you release data on where the hotspots are, GPS information on officers, and not using it in a way to tarnish the police or to be very critical of the police? A solution for this problem is by way of gaining the trust of this department, to gain the trust of the officers, to say this partnership is not about an audit. This is not a research institution that comes to take a GPS information to say that the police are bad. It's not about that. It's about collaborating together, making sure that both parties can gain something from this relationship by way of advancing the police and making law enforcement more efficient and more effective when they work together with a research institution. And I can think of at least 3 areas where the police might benefit from this kind of collaboration. One of them, the first one, is the least contentious. In other words, this is an area where the police can gain something from this relationship from this partnership with the research institution that doesn't cost them anything in terms of the sensitivity of the data. One of them, for example, is for the research institution to tell the police what works in other places. And that's by way of systematic reviews, for example, in a way to go and try to identify all the evidence that we have on a particular problem and how other departments have dealt with that in the past. One institution that does this well, and it's a clear example of partnerships between academics and excuse me, and the police in the UK, is the What Works Center in the College of Policing. The College of Policing provides information and training and research findings, like you see here, about different questions, strategic questions that might interest a chief of police. Does hotspots policing work? How should we deal with alcoholism and drugs and crime? What do we do with suspects that have mental illness issues? What kinds of tactics work well in civil unrest and which less? All these different questions have been answered, at least partially, in previous research. So the systematic review can provide the police with some answers on these particular questions. The problem, of course, with doing something like that is that it's not necessarily true that what works in London will work in Montevideo or will work in any other kind of city that you're thinking about, because it's not necessarily true that the settings and the police and the public are the same. For that, we need to create new research. We need to create new evidence. So Justice Tankebe, for example, who is a world expert on the legitimacy of the police, has been studying police legitimacy for many years now, would probably share with you that one of the benefits of collaborating with an academic institution or a research institution is the legitimacy of the new findings. See, here's the problem. It's a problem that there's no solution for as far as I can tell. Research that is being produced by the treatment provider, research that is being produced by the police, is not necessarily going to be found as legitimate because it's being produced by the police themselves. So even though you may have a very talented and very strong research department in the police, the findings that they will come up with, even if it's published in peer-reviewed journals, will always be suspect, because it's being produced by the treatment provider itself. The same institution that pays the researcher also pays a police officer. Now, I'm not at all insinuating that the data are biased. I'm not at all saying that. but it's the perceived legitimacy in the eyes of the public. You don't have to convince me, and nobody cares what I think. You don't have to convince the academic whether the findings are legitimate and whether the findings have been produced in the highest level possible. You have to produce the public. You have to convince the public, and for that, the research institution provides a layer of legitimacy to this approach, that to the approach of doing research, that can really enhance the findings of these particular problems. Now, I want to give one example where research collaboration and the question of legitimacy and the partnership came up in the past, and that is the research area of body-worn cameras. And body-worn cameras have exploded in the past few years because a lot of people said this is the tool that would increase legitimacy, that will calm down the friction between the police and members of the public. And in many ways, it's true, it does. We have examples where officers wearing body-worn cameras have minimized the friction between the sides without making a claim whose was at fault first. Because the body-worn camera, a device that an officer would wear on her uniform, on her, it could be on the glasses, it could be on a hat, it could be on the collar, different tactics on how to use body-worn cameras. But it calms down the situation because nobody wants to get caught doing something bad. Nobody wants to get caught assaulting an officer, having this strong evidence to then be presented in court that can send you to prison for a long time. Even if it's a matter of a political unrest, nobody wants to get in trouble, the officer nor the member of the public. So a device such as a body-worn camera has been an element of research that we've been looking at for several years now, and some findings are quite impressive and useful in a way to show the collaboration between the police and researchers. So here you have an example of a research project that was led by Cambridge University and several police departments around the world. I'm just going to present a part of it, a small segment of this, but I'm more than happy to talk about this later on in the questions and in the Q&A session, about the collaboration between researchers and academics on a particular problem. So one of the findings that we have, and it may be interesting to focus on just one issue, is the point of how much can we reduce assaults against officers by way of having body-worn cameras equipped on the police officers. And as you can see from different research sites, every one of these bar graphs, the black and the white bar graphs, is a research site where the research was managed by a police officer in collaboration with an academic. And they have found in this series of studies that using body-worn cameras really reduces the assaults against officers who are wearing body-worn cameras. And the way to do this, I believe, is by having a strong collaboration between the police and the researcher in a way that will make the findings trustworthy. We do this by creating a pracademic, somebody who's both a researcher and a police officer working at the same time. And by using practitioners in the field, we're able to produce research findings for the benefit of the police. With that, I'll stop, and I'll try to answer some questions that may come up about the issue, the different elements of how to collaborate and how to do this. But in the long run, the collaboration is quite beneficial for both the police and the academic. Thank you very much.